little bit more that are a little bit more pointed than what you have seen before. First of all, Great Falls is far from everywhere. Okay, a couple of fundamental reminders. Great Falls is far from everywhere. My associate Jameson here is going to speak in a moment about issues related to trucking. But before we move to the trucking part of the discussion, firstly, the fact that you are distant from everywhere, including you are distant from domestic markets, you are in fact, distant even from a place like Seattle, Tacoma, you're distant from there. Distance plus the necessity to be able to address volumes of merchandise means that rail must be a component of your development. Now, we were very upfront when we were hired by the Alliance that, Eli and I specifically were both railroaders, okay? So we bring that bias to the table. But the reality is that you are in a railroad-rich opportunity region. I believe you know that, but it's got to be key and central to your success. And of course, BNSF is your option. They are your one and only option. They are key and they are central. We are not anti-truck, okay? So if you think that you're hearing us deliver an anti-truck message, you have misunderstood our presentation. Trucking makes life as we know it in America possible the way that we know it. They are key to economic success as well. So trucking is also very much a part of the equation. Next slide. So in your region, we've got, go ahead, next slide. In your region, we have, you've got two BNSF lines that are significant. You have the east-west transcontinental, the Transcon line. This is a heavy capacity, high volume, high density stretch of railroad. And you've got the north-south BNSF line that, of course, runs from the border to Shelby and then to Great Falls and beyond. You're going to see that we are going to recommend a corridor strategy for the region. And that strategy needs to focus on the sole population center that you've got in the region, which is Great Falls itself. And it basically needs to run parallel to the BN line that runs north-south through the region. Importantly, that BNSF line runs parallel to Interstate 15. That is also key to your development. Elsewhere in our analysis, and we will come to it, I will come to it, you will see that we have a great focus on sites. You cannot compete if you don't have sites. We are not site selectors, strictly understood, okay? But that said, we know their lingo, and we know how to identify and configure competitive rail-served sites that will put you in a good position to compete on the site side. I will say that the sites along the Transcom will be problematic. Now, I'm putting my railroad hat on, okay? And they are problematic because it is a high density line, and it will be difficult for the railroad to make the choice to stop and serve a modest investor that lands along that Transcon. That's not to say that we dismiss the Transcon. We're going to come back to that. I'm going to make a few comments about that. But the focus of your site development focus really needs to be on the lower density BN line that runs north-south through the region. The other reality about the Transcon line is that you don't have a lot of people along that line. Your population focus, as you well know, is Great Falls itself. And obviously having the folks available to meet the requirements of a prospect is necessary, and you don't have that along the Transcon. There's a difference between properties and sites. Okay, and we're going to talk about this as well. Sites are properties that have been identified and they have been sufficiently secured, properly packaged, properly marketed, and available within a reasonable amount of time to be competitive. That includes some level of environmental review and, of course, zoning, permitting, utilities, et cetera. We're going to say more about that. And again, as I've already mentioned, the focus really is on Shelby to Great Falls, that stretch of railroad and interstate. We suggest that you move in the direction of the identification of at least 3 to 5 properties, probably 4 or 5 along this stretch, properties that can be converted into sites or that properties that can be aggregated and then converted to these sites. The juxtaposition of competitive rail-served sites relative to the interstate is key. Fortunately, by my count, and not including the interchanges specifically at each Shelby and Great Falls themselves, there are about 14 interchanges, I believe, on that stretch of interstate. The preferred sites will be operably efficient, not only from a railroad perspective, but also EC on, EC off relative to the interstates. Obviously, from a railroad perspective, the sites need to be flat. Rolling is not good. They need to be controlled, secured. That doesn't mean that they need to be owned, by the alliance, but they need to be under some level of control. Jameson, next slide. The port of northern Montana in Shelby is a plus. Perhaps even more exciting is the recent development of the Ponderosa facility at Agritech. Agritech is a very good investment for the region. It's a very strong site. We went out to look at it when we were there. It is a good and can be converted into a competitive location. And the immediate availability of transload capacity at this location is a significant development. Eli will say more about that later on. So strong encouragement with respect to Agritech. Important that you get it right. The border crossing at Sweetgrass is also very significant in considering your strategy. I believe there's a gentleman that was just speaking about Sweetgrass there just momentarily. I didn't realize that those folks would be there today. But Sweetgrass is an important component of your strategy. And it's a fairly unique crossing for a very long distance on the US-Canadian border, and you need to think carefully through that process. Next slide. So our core recommendation on this first item, again, development of a defined corridor with at least 4 or 5 competitive sites in this stretch of railroad and interstate from Shelby to Great Falls, probably with more focus on the Great Falls end of the stretch because of the population. The properties are defined, they're secured at some level. You want to have a mix of large sites as well as small, a variety, because that's going to allow you to compete for different types of industries and businesses. Think through your industry targets. Jameson is going to be speaking in a moment to that industry focus, where you fit in your market space, and also a positive differentiator in all of this would be if you were to brand your corridor. Let's move on to the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Let's stay here for a second. Branding the corridor is something that would be a differentiating factor for you. You need to brand it. You need to brand it with something that makes sense to the region, is easily digestible, and you use the branding to pursue as well, not only the prospects, you need to brand it, you need to market it properly. It needs to be properly emphasized on your website. And then frankly, you need to use branding for federal funding, to pursue federal funding, especially on the transportation side. We can assist you in that endeavor if you wish. By the way, this is not about getting more work for Moffatt and Nichol, although we're happy to take more work, okay? This is about helping you on your focus. But branding is really key. Next slide. You know, traditional railroading is an aggregation business, okay? It's not dissimilar to the way that a hub and spoke system works for the major airlines that use, for example, passengers that get on board in places like Great Falls, Montana, or Norfolk, Virginia, which is where I live, and then you travel from Norfolk, for example, to Atlanta, or you travel to Denver to a hub airport, and then you catch your connecting flight to your destination. Okay, so traditional railroading really is a massive aggregation business in which locals pick up individual rail cars at multiple locations. They aggregate them at classification yards, and then they go to the next hub location in their network, and they get disentangled, and then they get sent on again on their connections. Typically, a typical rail car moves in more than one connection. There's two major pieces of railroading from the Great Falls perspective. One is if you've got an economic location, like for example Calumet, that generates unit trains, full trains from one shipper going to one destination. That's a great thing. But a lot of it will also be, you want to be able to attract shippers that are going to have more modest amounts of rail traffic and need to be aggregated. So that also explains why, as an overtly general statement, the Transcon is not a place to do that, because the Transcon needs to remain very fluid from a railroad perspective. Now, in railroad parlance, intermodal means one and only one thing, and that is the movement of containers on trains. That's all it means, movement of containers on trains. In traditional railroading, unlike the traditional railroading, which is aggregation of individual rail cars, intermodal is largely a major market to major market business. Your region is not served by intermodal today, and that is not going to change in the near term. It's not going to change for a long time. And the reason it's not going to change is because you do not have adequate volume sufficiently to attract intermodal service. That said, intermodal, it's important to understand where you sit on the intermodal networks. This map starts showing that. It's important to understand how your businesses might use intermodal, even though it's further afield. Next slide. A picture of some intermodal realities in your general region. The BN, of course, key, and then both of the Canadian carriers that are of interest, because frankly they reach now all the way down through the southern U.S. and of course with the recent merger of a Canadian Pacific with KCS, you've got a movement down to Mexico. Next slide. And of course, I want to remind you again of the significance of the important availability of sweetgrass. I'm going to stop here. 2 footnotes before I turn it over to Jameson. One is, again, that despite the significant importance of the north-south corridor, which needs to be branded, you should also think about identifying a couple of sites on the East-West Transcon, despite what I just said. And again, I just emphasize the proximity to the Canadian crossing at Sweetgrass, very important. There are some other elements to put into your thought process here, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jameson.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I'll be talking about the truck backhaul opportunity that we believe is an advantage for the region. So In reviewing previous studies commissioned by the Alliance, as well as interviewing with some of the local businesses in the Great Falls region, analyzing freight flow data on truck at the state level, and taking a look at the trucking rates data in and out of the Great Falls region specifically, it's become clear to us that there is a large freight imbalance when it comes to trucking in the Great Falls region. Particularly for large and distant metro areas, we see more goods coming in by truck to Montana than going out. And while this is a logistical challenge, certainly, it also indicates the availability of trucks in the area seeking backhaul loads, particularly to those distant but large metro areas in the Western United States. And we suggest the Alliance work with local freight brokers to better understand the nature of this imbalance, particularly the kinds of markets that they see it for a large extent, as well as the equipment that tends to have imbalanced trucking, so that they can market it to some, but not all, prospective businesses coming to the Great Falls region who might have an interest in outbound shipping. And as we'll show, this imbalance tends to push the inbound truck rates higher. And therefore, it's not something that you'd want to market widely. But for some businesses that you can find have an opportunity to take advantage of this backhaul, it's certainly something to market as an advantage. Now, as Rob said, the Great Falls region, put simply, is far from everywhere. And what we mean by everywhere in particular are these large metro areas in the Pacific Northwest, such as Seattle or Oregon, Northern California, such as San Francisco, over to Salt Lake City in Utah. And these cities are in the hundreds of miles away. And this likely plays a role in what we see as the freight imbalance. Oftentimes, producers are going to face a trade-off between locating close to the source of inputs used in production or locating closer to the end markets which they seek to access. And, as you can imagine, some businesses looking to access these metros may prefer to move closer to them, while Great Falls is rather isolated. But nonetheless, it's still important to keep in mind that both current and prospective businesses that could come to the Great Falls region will take an interest in these larger metros as premier markets due to their large size, as well as some of the higher incomes that are found in the region. And for that reason, we think that the Alliance should continue to understand these logistical challenges faced by businesses in Great Falls seeking to reach these distant but large markets, and figure out how to prevent it from being a reason not to locate there, and possibly to market, to turn it into a pro as opposed to a con for the region. So looking at the evidence of this freight imbalance, I'll first direct your attention to the two maps at the lower half of the slide. On the left, we can see the inbound truck tonnage to Montana by state. And on the right, we can see the outbound truck tonnage from Montana to different states. And as you'll note, we see a considerable amount of goods being sourced into Montana by truck from larger states such as Washington, California, Utah, but very little amounts of trucked freight going back out. We note that Idaho, which borders Montana, tends to have much more balanced freight on truck going in and out because of how integrated the two economies are. But when it comes to these larger distant metros, it's highly imbalanced on the inbound side. For example, we see that Montana brings in about 2.5 more truck tonnage from Washington than it sends back out. And similarly, we see about 4.5 times more truck tonnage coming into Montana from Utah than it sends out. And note that Washington accounts for 12% of the inbound truck tonnage coming to the state, and Utah accounts for 11% of the inbound truck tonnage. So these are large volumes coming in, considerably large, and very little going back out to those source markets, looking at Montana as a whole, right? Now, when we look at the Great Falls region more closely, we see in the upper right that there is a large premium placed on inbound truck rates compared to outbound. They're about 28% higher. And this is a much wider gap than we see in perhaps you could say somewhat similar regions that are also isolated and have a similar agricultural economic base, such as Twin Falls, Idaho, or Bismarck, North Dakota. And what this indicates practically is that truckers, oh, and to clarify, sorry, these truck rates are focused on the major metro areas of the Western United States. And what this indicates practically is that a truck delivering goods coming in from a metro such as Seattle or say, Medford, Oregon, must be compensated for not being able to get backhaul filled and paid for by another customer back out of Montana to the source market. So because trucks come into the region full, make deliveries, but then have to drive out empty in search of more haul, shippers in the Great Falls region are forced to pay an extra premium. As we said, this is definitely a logistical challenge, but it's important to note that it also indicates a likely availability of trucks in the area that are actively seeking backhaul to those markets. If it were available, they would certainly be looking to take freight and get paid for it going back to their origin markets. And in this, we see an opportunity. So as we looked at this relationship between the outbound versus inbound rates, as well as the freight flows to Montana, we noted that it seems quite common throughout the majority of the Western metro areas. Looking at the table on the bottom, while at the state level, the freight in some cases is highly imbalanced, such as Salt Lake City and Seattle, with red figures indicating much higher inbound versus outbound. We see some other regions that seem to have more balanced freight. That's at the state level. When we look at the Great Falls region in particular, we still see the same outbound discount, much more broadly speaking, which may indicate that the Great Falls region is more imbalanced for these metros as opposed to other parts of Montana. And we believe that it is in the best interest of the Alliance to better understand through discussion with local freight brokers what the variation in the imbalance looks like between these different trade lanes, if you will, between truck freight moving back and forth to these different metro markets. We think the key questions are to understand what is the extent of the imbalance of freight moving from, say, Great Falls to Seattle versus Great Falls to Salt Lake City, and make a note of that. What do the local freight brokers see? Secondly, it's important to understand what kind of equipment tends to see more of this imbalance, if so. Is it primarily an imbalance of vans coming in and going out empty, or flat cars coming in and going out empty, or reefers? What kinds of trucks are on these trade lanes in Great Falls and are experiencing this kind of imbalance? And it's also important to understand the scheduling. How frequently are these trucks coming in versus, how often are trucks being filled going back out? And the reason why it's important to understand this dynamic is because with this information in your back pocket, should a prospective business come and seek to begin operating in the Great Falls region, you'll be able to ask them questions that might indicate, based on the nature of different freight imbalances in markets, whether or not it would be a positive for them and should be marketed to them. Because as we said, this is not necessarily something to market broadly, but it's rather business specific. For example, a prospective business, it would be, of course, pertinent to understand, Are they outbound focused? Are they looking for specific consumer markets to access outside of Montana, such as Salt Lake City versus Seattle? What kind of equipment do they require? And if you can begin to see some sorts of matches between what this prospective business, it may be one out of several, right? It's obviously not always going to line up perfectly, but if you can find some sorts of connections between these prospective businesses and what you understand to be the issue on the ground, there may be an example of, say, lots of vans coming in from Salt Lake City, very little going back out, and a business interested in that market could be pitched on, well, we understand there to be an availability of trucks looking for that backhaul. That is an advantage for a outbound seeking business, because as we know, particularly in the Montana area, being sure that you find trucks to bring your goods to where they need to go is a concern. I would add as well that it would be ideal for increased backhaul to lower the freight imbalance, with the possibility of seeing some pressure come off of those higher inbound rates that are currently experienced by shippers in the Great Falls region. As I said, Twin Falls, Idaho, Bismarck, North Dakota do not see the extent of this freight imbalance or this premium on the inbound rates. The spread is much more narrow. And when we look at the outbound trucking dynamic of these states, Idaho has a much stronger propensity to be trucking goods outbound to a variety of markets, whether they be in the Pacific Northwest, California, Texas, or Utah. And similarly, it's bringing goods in from those regions, so the freight is more balanced. With respect to North Dakota, it's a much smaller market, and it tends to be trucking primarily out to Minnesota. Nonetheless, it has a strong enough balance to take some pressure off of those inbound rates. As you saw on the previous slide, in fact, it's enough to actually put the outbound rates higher, because they seem to have the opposite problem of Montana, with more going out than going in. But nonetheless, in an ideal situation, by improving the backhaul, you may be able to take the pressure off of the inbound shippers from having to compensate truckers for that previously typically empty backhaul. With that, I'll progress to begin talking about some of the value-added production that we see as an opportunity in the Great Falls region. So here, as Rob said, we're not telling you anything that you probably don't know. And in fact, we understand that you guys have actively pursued this with success, I might add, with initiatives such as the Agritech Park. But nonetheless, we hope to reiterate the importance of leveraging agriculture inputs in pursuit of more value-added production. And perhaps we can provide some insights that may help you take a new perspective on this effort. So as I said, Great Falls has just proximity to a large amount of raw agriculture inputs. And while there is some value-added production at present, I would say it still remains quite limited. Limited relative to some other regions in the upper mountain of the US as well. And with an abundance of agriculture inputs and an abundance of water, there's certainly opportunities to move above the farming and exporting area of the supply chain, and even beyond some of the first step value added, such as milling, into ideally consumer-focused finished products. We think that the Alliance should continue to support the companies currently engaged in the higher value-added manufacturing, ranging from the mills, of course, as well to Pasta, Montana, as an example. And it should look for opportunities to connect the currently value-added manufacturers with some of their potential customers who could see them as producing inputs, as well as other value-added producers in the region, to look to combine inputs as needed into more finished products. So going through some examples of these currently active value-added, I would say, producers in the region. We had the opportunity to sit down with several of these folks while we were in Great Falls. Very interesting discussions. I would say, first and foremost, when we see that first level above the farming level of the supply chain, we have companies like Malt Europe, turning barley into malt, General Mills milling flour, Montana Specialty Mills producing specialty canola oil from crushed canola, as well as on the livestock side, companies potentially like Friesen Foods and Montana Eggs, taking that livestock inventory and turning it into products. And we think that, you know, given the abundance of the agriculture nearby, there's certainly an opportunity to pursue expanding these kinds of businesses in the area. But there's also the opportunity to try and take it a step further. And that's through things like a commercial brewery with the malt, as opposed to some of the more microbrewery focus that we currently see, given the abundance of water in the region. Things that are more akin to what we see with Pasta Montana, where they're taking the milled flour from the region and producing a finished product like pasta. And I think it's important as well for us to consider how we can take some of the businesses currently producing these value-added products like pasta and combine them amongst each other into something like a canned soup or noodles and vegetable products that we see canned and shipped to consumer markets. Things such as condiments and sauces and salad products to be combined with a company like Montana Specialty Mills. I would note that transload and warehousing is key for these businesses in the food and beverage industry, particularly for those looking for refrigerated products. They would need refrigerated transport, which may require transload into refrigerated rail cars or refrigerated warehousing, all of which could benefit from the support of the Alliance as those initiatives, if I should say, those initiatives begin to expand more greatly. I would note as well that while it's more difficult to make industry-specific claims, we do see a reefer discount on the outbound compared to inbound, which may suggest an opportunity for backhaul. And while that's not necessarily something to pursue, when you discuss some of those logistics challenges that I previously mentioned with freight brokers in the region, it could be beneficial to be considering these food industry companies in mind as you have those discussions and what their challenges might be and where they could take advantage of backhaul opportunities if possible. So underlying all of this, as I said, something that many of you already know is the robustness of the agriculture industry in Montana. Obviously, Montana is known primarily for its beef and for its wheat, and Great Falls is in a great location to take advantage of that. We think it's essential for the Alliance as well to market some of the other unique products being produced in the region that have a concentration in Montana, whether they be lentils, mustard, pea products, flax seeds, and understand how to market those out to potential food and beverage producers coming into the region, and how to look for opportunities to combine these kinds of products with the other products being produced at the moment in Montana. More value-added products, I should say. Another product of interest that we note is canola. While not presently the highest concentration in Montana, nonetheless, this is a growing industry, and it's essential to work with Montana Specialty Mills and understand how this industry is expanding and what kinds of food products could be produced from here, particularly if it continues to expand in Montana. And, you know, obviously with your connection to Alberta, there may be opportunities to pursue further industrial development in the canola-related food space. And with that, I will pass the mic on to Eli to discuss these kinds of marketing materials as well as transload opportunities in the region.
Thank you, Jameson. Next slide, please. So one of the suggestions that we make in the report is obviously the marketing material review. And as Rob and Jameson have both alluded to, we're saying a lot of things that the Alliance already knows. So please forgive us, but we're reiterating things that we feel like are important to help increase your chances for success. One thing that I would note on what we have termed as the backhaul opportunity for Great Falls. And Jameson and I have discussed this a couple of times. The marketing opportunity for the Alliance is not necessarily to say to a shipper, we can save you X amount of dollars by locating in Great Falls, because you can't, because it is more expensive to ship with that backhaul than other competing regions. However, what you can say is that there is an availability of trucking equipment in the region actively pursuing backhaul opportunities. And so that equipment availability is something that you could exploit to prospects looking in the region. And to Jameson's point, an understanding of the types of the type of equipment, the amount of equipment, and where the equipment is going to and from is key and will help inform your discussion with those prospects. So discussing with the local firms, their logistics managers, as well as truck boat brokers is key to understanding the opportunity and how to market. Again, we're suggesting marketing from an equipment availability perspective versus cost. Additionally, previous to my role here at Moffatt and Nichol, I worked as a local development authority executive here in Georgia, as Rob mentioned earlier. Each and every year that I was in that position, obviously, I had a pitch that I would give to site selection consultants. The local utility here would also sponsor an event each and every year called Pitch Perfect. And one of the things that I learned through participating in Pitch Perfect was, I wouldn't say that I learned, but it was reiterated, was the importance of maps and where you sit within a specific area of the country and how you're connected to other areas of the country. So transportation-focused maps, whether from a railroad perspective, airport perspective, port perspective, or highway perspective. Knowing where you sit in relation to other markets is key for site selection consultants. And obviously there are maps on the website, but I do think you can never have enough maps to tell your story and how you're connected with the rest of the world. I would also say that, even some of the maps that we've shared here today, such as the proximity to agriculture inputs, can really help sell your story to those firms, or excuse me, those industries, not firms, that we have identified in the previous section. Your proximity to the grain, wheat, barley, meat, all of those things. Those are really good maps that can be placed on your website to, again, help brand and promote yourselves to those industries. I would also say that one thing with respect to the marketing materials for Agritech Park, very nice looking professional material that you already have exists, and it looks really good. What I would suggest is taking it a step further and clearly communicating, what property is controlled, how it's configured, and then what is the vision that the authority / alliance is casting for that piece of property. And I do think that that's something that could be addressed to again take it one step further. I would also say that to the outside world, and you may have picked up on what I just said when I mentioned authority versus alliance. With the website presence, it's a little bit unclear as to, is it the Great Falls Development Alliance? Is it the Great Falls Development Authority? Or is it Grow Great Falls? You know, so just making sure that those things are clear to those outside of Great Falls, outside of Montana, are very important. Again, I would say you're not alone in that. Previous experience, I had the sort of the same challenges with our web presence, and had to go through and review and make it clear that the county even had a development authority in addition to a chamber of commerce. So you're not alone there, but that is certainly something to keep in mind. Next slide, please, Jameson. Again, as I mentioned before, what we've shown here are just examples potentially of, you know, a new, clear, concise presentation of Agritech Park. Also, where is Agritech Park? Where is Great Falls relative to other areas in the country? And again, that is to make it clear to the outside world, not necessarily those within Montana, specifically site selection consultants. Next slide, please. Keep going. Also, so one of our final suggested focal points is to discuss transloading and cross-dock warehousing. Transloading in a transload facility is a business recruitment tool, a huge benefit that many communities do not have. You obviously do not have an intermodal facility in your area, and likely will not for a good time. But what you do have is a transloading facility on the northern end of the corridor that we have defined, as well as an incoming transload facility. So again, I would say really focus on marketing that to the outside world as something that is a huge asset, because it truly is. I would also say that transloading and warehousing are directly related to the industries that we identified in the previous slides. Those industries rely heavily upon the availability of those two services. So they all three kind of, the industry with the transloading and warehousing capability, they absolutely go hand in hand. So looking at those as recruitment tools and exploiting them to the outside world and to site selection consultants who specialize in food and beverage manufacturing. Next slide, please. Here you can see where we've put together a potential layout of what rail service or expanded rail service to a proposed cross-dock warehouse, in addition to potentially what the Ponderosa facility might look like. Again, we don't necessarily know that yet, but we do know that that's the location. When we talk about maps, this is a very good depiction of the sorts of items that site selection consultants are used to looking for. It has your utilities, it has everything sort of laid out, and shows the proximity to the site in which they're considering. So this is a good example that we've given, you know, that we feel like can help make your pitch and your web presence more successful to the outside world. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we had covered that portion, but again,
Yeah, yeah, we had different text on this one, Eli. It's the same picture, but it's different text.
Yes, yes. So again, I guess the final item that I wanted to mention was that by having the transload operations at the north end and the south end of the corridor, what you're doing is introducing competition into the supply chain, and you are providing existing businesses and potential new businesses with flexibility in their logistics profile. And I think that's certainly something key for your future economic development success. And I think with that, we are ready to turn it back to Dr.
Yeah,
Martinez.
thank you so much, Eli. Yeah, so with that, we will turn it back. I think we'll be pretty clear on what our major recommendations are, having to do with the essential role of rail, the focus on the Shelby to Great Falls corridor, with Sweetgrass there as an extension of that corridor, the need to focus on sites, the opportunity you have to pitch yourselves for investors that are looking for backhaul, and obviously the recognized need to move up the value chain, which I know you already know that. And then finally, the need to improve your marketing materials, look at those again, see if you can make them better. And then obviously we're very pro transloading, I think, and we think that that's a good development there for the region. So with that, we're gonna turn it back to you, Brett, and any others with respect to any comments or questions.